This is Chapter 4 of Death and Disorder, A History of Modern England from 1485 to 1690 by Ken Macmillan. The title is called Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, 1558 to 1603. First section, Death and Disorder. The London Plague of 1603. Disorder came in many forms in early modern England, such as the havoc caused by frequent outbreaks of medieval and early modern Europe's greatest pestilence, the bubonic plague. The plague was caused by a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, which was carried by black rats and transmitted to humans from a flea bite. Once contracted by humans, the plague could spread pneumatically by air and was therefore particularly severe in large urban areas such as London. Physical signs of the plague included coughing and sneezing, enlargement of the lymph nodes, buboes, in the armpits, groin, and throat, a ring of sores around the neck, and acral necrosis. I don't know what acral necrosis is, maybe you do. Which causes the blackening of infected body parts and gave the plague its more common name, the, quote, Black Death, end quote. A horrible and painful death occurred within a mere few days. Although today we know that the cause of the disease was bacterial, its cause was not known in the early modern period. Contemporaries speculated that God was unhappy either with the Catholic Church or with ongoing reforms. Others blamed astrological and astronomical phenomenon. Still others blamed natural disasters such as earthquakes for releasing poisonous gases from deep within the earth. Various scapegoats came under suspicion, including witches and Jews, all of whom suffered at least social estrangement and frequently death at the hands of angry mobs or the criminal justice system. Nor was early modern medicine up to the task of dealing with plague. Traditional treatments to cure the body, sweating, bloodletting, vomiting, the application of pigeon blood, and poultices failed to slow death or spread of the disease. The London Plague of 1603 was the most severe since the medieval period, claiming 30,000 to 40,000 souls in the city. In The Wonderful Year, the writer Thomas Dekker lamented that infected corpses were either burned or buried in mass graves covered in lye. In his final state of rest, the deceased, quote, buried like dogs, end quote, were denied the dignity of a proper Christian burial. Dekker went on to describe in detail the impact of the plague in London. The state closed theaters to limit the presence of large crowds and forced the infected and their families into isolation with painted markings on their doors and windows to warn others. Fear drove some to burn the buildings that housed the sick. Those who could flee to the less populous countryside did so, although naturally this was a privilege only available to the wealthy. Yeah, and there's a picture here of with the title Burial of Plague Victims in Mass Graves circa 1665, and it's a bunch of fairly shallow looking mass graves, actually. It says on the picture, carts of dead to bury. Dekker also describes the sorrow felt by those who survived. Quote, lend me art to paint and delineate to the life the whole story of this mortal and pestiferious battle, and you the ghost of those more by many than 40,000 that with the virulent poison of infection have been driven out of your earthly dwellings, you desolate hand-wringing widows that beat your bosoms over your departing husbands, you woefully distracted mothers that with disheveled hair fallen into swoon, whilst you lie kissing the insensible cold lips of your breathless infants, you outcast and downtrodden orphans, that shall many a year hence remember more freshly to mourn, join your hands together, and with your bodies cast a ring about me. Let me behold your ghastly visages, that my paper may receive their true pictures. Echo forth your groans through the hollow trunk of my pen, and rain down your gummy tears into mine ink, that even marble bosoms may be shaken with terror, and hearts of adamant melt into compassion. End quote. Thomas Dekker, The Wonderful Year. Dekker's was merely one of several accounts of the last Elizabethan plague that described its inhumanity, the loss of family and neighborliness, the, quote, sins, end quote, of flight and fear, and the failure of physicians to treat the afflicted and of priests to respect the dead. The plague took on a literary genre of its own, shaping the Carpe Diem, Seize the Day, and Danse Macabre, Dance of Death themes that characterized much 17th century poetry. During the outbreak of 1603, for example, the playwright and poet Ben Jonson lost his 7-year-old son, Benjamin, and lamented on this tragedy in the poem, quote, On my first son, end quote. Farewell, quote, Farewell, thou child, of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope for thee, loved boy. 7 years thou were lent to me, and I thee pay, exacted by thy fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all father now? For why will man lament the state he should envy? To have so soon escaped worlds and flesh's rage, and if no other misery yet age. Rest in soft peace, and asked, say, quote, Here doth lie Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry, for whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, as what he loves may never like too much. End quote. Jonson's poem speaks both to the pain parents felt for the loss of a child and to the joy that survivors were, according to church teaching, supposed to feel for the deceased's escape from earthly troubles and their beginnings of everlasting bliss in heaven. The boy was Jonson's, quote, best piece of poetry, end quote, his most significant creation, and the author ends the poem by vowing not to get too attached to the things he loves, to reduce future grief. As Dekker attested, however, common death by plague was, in early modern England, it created a heavy burden for its survivors. Discussion question 4.1. Do you think plague narratives, which were often quite gruesome in their details, why do you think plague narratives, which were often quite gruesome in their details, became so prevalent throughout the 17th century? I gotta turn the fan on. Tommy boy is hot. New section. The Virgin Queen and the Cult of Elizabeth. The accession of Elizabeth Tudor to the English throne in November 1558 went smoothly, in contrast to recent events such as Somerset's eclipsing of Edward's appointed Regency Council and Lady Jane Grey's brief usurpation of Mary's throne. This time the wishes of Henry VIII for succession were respected. Elizabeth's path to queenship was made easier by an elaborate and expensive coronation held on the day prescribed by the royal astrologer John Dee as the day that would lead to a long and happy reign. Elizabeth was also strengthened by being possibly the best educated and most intelligent of the Tudor monarchs, especially after her return to the succession in 1544 and placement into the household of Catherine Parr, she was given excellent humanist tutors. One such tutor was Roger Ascham, author of the Schoolmaster of 1570, the Schoolmaster, published in 1570, which described the ideal humanist education as it was provided to Elizabeth. The new queen's knowledge of the classics was exceptional for the time, as was her mastery of Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. Nor did Elizabeth's education end in her teen years. Even as queen, she continued advanced studies in Greek and produced translations as late as 1598. At the outset of Elizabeth's reign, everybody, likely even the queen, assumed that she would marry, and sooner rather than later. This was still a society that believed women were incapable of possessing or exercising the intelligence or strength of men, which were necessary in interpreting law, carrying out constitutional responsibilities, leading armies into battle, and deciding delicate matters of state with sound reason and good judgment. Mastering the art of double translating Greek was one thing, running an early modern European monarchy was quite another. While few questioned the queen's right to rule, many doubted the fitness of a woman to do so well, and the recent specter of Mary's reign did not help this perception. A king consort, therefore, could provide Elizabeth with much-needed male advice and possibly relieve her of some or all of the burdens of rule. Most importantly, marriage was the only sure way for Elizabeth to produce an heir, preferably male, to secure an orderly succession to the throne. Recent history of premature royal death by sickness and disease had taught Elizabeth's advisers that the queen could die at any time. These feelings only intensified when she was nearly carried away by smallpox in 1562. Parliament and the Privy Council first approached the Queen about marriage in 1559. Elizabeth prevaricated, either out of concern for the good of the realm or for the stability of her own crown. Various foreign suitors presented themselves, which served the valuable purpose of legitimizing her reign in the eyes of Europe. However, most of these men were Catholic and therefore could not be considered by Elizabeth at such a delicate time in the Reformation. The sting of Mary's wedding to Philip and the rebellions that it spawned were in very recent memory. Another potential suitor was Elizabeth's childhood friend, Robert Dudley, for whom the Queen had developed genuine affection. Marriage became a distant possibility when Dudley's wife Amy fell down a flight of stairs to her death in 1560, leaving Dudley, whatever his suspected role in his wife's death, a widower free to remarry. Her council was strongly against the marriage, and at some point Elizabeth, too, decided that she could not marry one of her own subjects. Parliament continued to press the Queen to marry in 1563, 1566, and again between 1578 and 1582. Elizabeth entertained two candidates during this time, Archduke Charles of Austria and Francois, Duke of Anjou. But after the marriage negotiations began, both enterprises failed on the grounds of religion. By the time the Anjou match was being considered, the Queen was nearly 50 years old, was unlikely to bear a child, and had effectively governed her realm for a quarter century. A Catholic marriage, even if it had diplomatic advantages, was not popular if an heir was no longer a possible outcome of the union. In the end, as is common knowledge, Elizabeth never married. By the 1580s, she began to style herself as the Virgin Queen, married only to her people. Her chaste state was promoted by numerous writers of the age, not least Edmund Spenser, whose Fairy Queen, published in 1596, memorialized the aging monarch as Gloriana, the leading character and a clear allegory of Elizabeth. William Shakespeare also celebrated the Virgin theme in A Midsummer Night's Dream, circa 1596. Here's a passage from A Midsummer Night's Dream. I saw Cupid all armed, a certain aim he took, at a fair vestal virgin, throned by the west. All right, let me repeat that. I saw Cupid all armed, a certain aim he took, at a fair vestal, throned by the west. A vestal is a virgin. But I might see young Cupid's fiery shaft quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votaris passed on, in maiden meditation, fancy-free. That was the excerpt. Not even Cupid's powerful arrow, quote, loosed smartly from his bow, end quote, could claim the chastity of the queen, who gave a vow, thus making her a, quote, votaris, to remain a virgin and serve her people. Portrait artists also celebrated her virgin state. Quentin Metzys, the younger Sieves portrait, finished in 1583, Elizabeth is depicted holding the symbol of the Vestal Virgin, Tusia, who, with God's assistance, carried water in a sieve to vindicate herself after her chastity was questioned. Near the end of Elizabeth's life, Oscar Oliver painted the Rainbow Portrait, 1600, which depicted the queen as Austraea, the virginal Greek goddess who was to return to Earth and bring with her a golden age that would end human suffering. In the face of such literary and artistic outpouring, whether Elizabeth was in fact a virgin, her youthful and affectionate dalliances with Dudley, perhaps suggesting otherwise, was immaterial. In spite of the, quote, cult of Elizabeth, end quote, that enshrouded the last Tudor monarch, the Virgin Queen was at least as Machiavellian as her father. She was vain, arrogant, and unpredictable, possessed a famously fiery temper, and did not hesitate to rebuke publicly, and occasionally physically, important men who failed to follow her instructions, assumed authority they were not explicitly granted, or treated her like a mere woman. Elizabeth deliberately employed counselors who disagreed with each other, expecting both that disunity within the council would require regular consultation with her, and that the council would not unite in a single voice against her. She did not hesitate to imprison men who criticized her or her closest counselors, and became incensed when her council or parliament discussed certain matters without her permission. At court, Elizabeth was patron to a number of, quote, favorites, end quote, such as the handsome Dudley, who became Earl of Leicester in 1560. I don't know how to say that. There's no CH in there, but I'm going to say Leicester. Yeah, I'm going to look it up right now. Come on, you son of a gun.
Leicester.
Is that how you say it? Say it Leicester? Sorry, I gotta figure this out.
Leicester.
Huh, it's Leicester, huh? Look at that. Leicester in 1564. Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Christopher Hatton, who later became Lord Chancellor. She affectionately gave these men nicknames. Leicester was, quote, eyes, end quote. Hatton, quote, lids, end quote, and bestowed numerous titles on them that brought both wealth and power. Yet these men could also be the victims of her famous wrath, as was Leicester when he married without permission in 1578, although the two later reconciled. Elizabeth Elizabeth also selected wise counselors with experience at statesmanship. This is illustrated especially in her appointments for the position of Secretary of State, the role once held by Thomas Cromwell. At the outset of her reign, she appointed Sir William Cecil, a long-time servant under Edward and Mary, into this position. In one of Elizabeth's few elevations to the peerage, Cecil was created Baron Burghley in 1572, which placed him into the House of Lords and took on an even greater role as Lord Treasurer. Another key secretary was Sir Francis Walsingham, the brilliant, quote, spy master, end quote, whose intelligence gathering averted several dynastic crises during the Elizabethan era. For good reason, Elizabeth deeply mourned the loss of Walsingham. Another key secretary was Sir Francis Walsingham, the brilliant, quote, spy master, end quote, whose intelligence gathering averted several dynastic crises during the Elizabethan era. For good reason, Elizabeth deeply mourned the loss of Walsingham in 1590 and Burghley in 1598. Still another important secretary was Burghley's son and Walsingham's mentee, Sir Robert Cecil, whom the Queen nicknamed, quote, Pygmy, end quote, due to his small stature, who served in that role beyond Elizabeth's death. All these men brought credibility and experience to the government and were fiercely loyal to the Queen. Elizabeth's court was also as magnificent and peripatetic as the early Tudors. She surrounded herself with women, mostly from noble and gentle families, who attended to her every need, dressed in exquisite clothing, and allegedly spent up to 2 hours each morning in the privy chamber dressing, and another 2 each evening undressing. The Queen divided her time between several palaces, especially Whitehall, St. James's, Placentia, and Windsor, and undertook lengthy and expensive summer progresses throughout the countryside, depending on wealthy nobles to provide for her extensive entourage while in residence. Elizabeth also enjoyed masques, dancing, and music, and especially during holidays, the court was abuzz with these activities. Her preference for entertainment and the attention of her favorite sometimes meant that, also like her father, Elizabeth could not always be relied upon to attend to matters of state efficiently, which was a cause of consternation for her counselors, whom she often kept waiting inordinate amounts of time for decisions. In sum, the Virgin Queen was truly her father's daughter, and a consummate Tudor monarch. New section. The Elizabethan settlement. Much to the satisfaction of many, including the Marian exiles who flooded back into England, Elizabeth was Protestant thanks to her childhood relationship with Catherine Parr and the fact that she was born of a union that could be deemed legitimate only if the break from Rome was fait accompli. Beyond Elizabeth's general embrace of the royal supremacy of the Church and a certain degree of Protestant-leaning reform, however, it is difficult to define precisely what the Queen's personal religious views were. This was possibly because, unlike other Tudor monarchs, she viewed religion as a matter of political expediency rather than personal faith. To this end, Elizabeth dismissed all Catholics from her privy council and appointed several men, including Cecil, who probably had the single greatest role in designing the reform package with moderate reformist desires. The new council was virtually devoid of religious officials. This meant that the proposals for religious reform ultimately put to Parliament in February 1559 were designed by secular individuals for whom religion was also largely a political matter. The religious settlement had two main goals: restoration of the royal supremacy of the Church and movement toward Protestant reform. Neither of these goals was easily achievable given the current composition of Parliament. A vocal minority of the House of Commons was strongly Catholic, but more vitally, the House of Lords was dominated by Catholics, including the Marian bishops and abbots who still held their positions. To achieve their goals, Elizabeth and the council arranged for the, quote, Westminster Disputation, end quote, in March. In theory, the meeting was an opportunity for Protestants and Catholics to debate the issue of supremacy, but in practice it was a subterfuge that resulted in the imprisonment of 2 bishops and an abbot, just enough to upset the majority opinion in the Lords. The Queen also agreed to a concession to satisfy the Conservatives by making herself, quote, supreme governor, end quote, rather than, quote, supreme head, end quote, of the Church. The second goal of the settlement was movement toward Protestant reform. Here, too, Elizabeth and her council made compromises to satisfy Parliament. Many in both houses were concerned with the extremism of the Second Book of Common Prayer, which was strongly Calvinist with regard to images, vestments, and the interpretation of the Eucharist. This liturgy was repugnant not only to Roman Catholics and anti-papal Henrician Catholics, but also to many of the more conservative Protestants, such as Lutherans. To appease these conservatives, a new Act of Uniformity promised a revised version of the 1552 prayer book that retracted some of its perceived radical elements but retained predestination, establishing what has been referred to as a via media, middle way, religion. The communion service, which had become a commemorative event in 1552, was ambiguously restored as a Mass, so that conservatives who wanted a sacrificial ceremony during the Eucharist were satisfied. The act also included a proviso that authorized the use of, quote, ornaments, end quote, vestments, crosses, candles, altars, and others according to the terms of the 1549 Lutheran-oriented prayer book, which would also appease centrist views. This proviso was, however, subject to review by the Queen and her religious officials and gave hope to Calvinists that further reform was forthcoming. Naturally, despite seeking a compromise on the issues of greatest concern to the conservatives in Parliament, which allowed the Elizabethan religious reform package to pass through that body successfully, the settlement was not satisfactory to those on the religious extremes. This applied especially to the current episcopal bench, which was filled entirely with Catholics. In the summer of 1559, the Marian bishops were obliged to resign, and the episcopacy was quickly filled with Protestants. About half of these bishops, including the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Matthew Parker, had remained in England in seclusion during the reign of Mary. The other half had been former Marian exiles who had resided primarily in 2 locations, Strasbourg and Zurich. These were reformed communities that took a, quote, middle way, end quote, position between Lutheranism and Calvinism. Zurich reformers, for example, supported Erastianism, clerical hierarchy within the Church, and a largely Lutheran approach to their understanding of the Eucharist as established in the 1540 Consensus Tigurinus. There is evidence that the supporters of this religious position were present on the Privy Council and that leading members of the Zurich Reformed tradition corresponded with Elizabeth and other officials in the events leading up to the parliamentary passage of the settlement. Although the new episcopacy could, therefore, agree with many aspects of the new brand of Anglicanism, there was still disagreement about the use of ornaments, about which the Zurich Reformed tradition was less tolerant. Some bishops supported their use provided they could make decisions on these matters within their own diocese, while others remained opposed on the grounds that these devices were Catholic and superstitious. In an episcopal visitation of 1560, some of the visitors went so far as to order the removal of images from churches, an act of iconoclasm that went against the ornaments proviso and provoked reaction from the Queen, whose own chapel royal displayed a crucifix. Ultimately, after 2 controversies over vestments in the 1560s, the dissenting bishops decided that it was better to accept the proviso than resign their positions and possibly be replaced by extremists. In fact, one of these bishops, John Jewel, became the Church of England's leading defender in the immediate aftermath of the settlement. He produced several treatises, likely commissioned by Cecil, designed to explain the current state of the Church and contradict claims that the English clergy was rife with factionalism. Jewel's Apology of the Church of England became the unofficial confession of faith for the new religion. The final major step towards the acceptance of the religious settlement was its passage from convocation, the religious body that met simultaneously with Parliament. Although the precedent had been set under the earlier Tudors for Parliament to legislate for religion, this was a comparatively new phenomenon. In 1559, the Catholic-dominated convocation had not been asked for its opinion with respect to religious reform, so the more Protestant 1563 body took the opportunity to voice its opinion. Here again, the key issue was the ornaments proviso in the Uniformity Act. Various members of the lower house of convocation, later termed Precisians, quote, Precisians, end quote, by Parker, supported further reform, such as the end of vestments, and that the communion table not be positioned, quote, altar-wise, end quote. Some of the bishops also supported further reform, although ultimately convocation accepted the version of the settlement as explained by Jewell. It also passed the 39 Articles, the Church's official statement of faith. This is a more conservative version of the Edwardian 42 Articles, although the Articles continued to accept the doctrine of predestination. For the next 2 decades, Puritans, as the Precisians came to be called, continued to push for further reforms, sometimes quite aggressively. One example of this is the pamphlet war of Cambridge professor Thomas Cartwright in the early 1570s. After his removal from his position because of his critical stance against bishops, Cartwright resorted to the medium of print to support his belief that the church should be neither Erastian nor Episcopal. Instead, it should be Presbyterian, meaning that religious decisions should be made by elected assemblies of clergymen and laymen. Unsurprisingly, the Queen bristled at the idea that the church should be governed without the royal prerogative. The religious situation in England was far too delicate, too needful of uniformity, and too married to politics, diplomacy, and the very concept of royal authority to rely on the whims of men who had already proven too radical for the Queen. Elizabeth relied primarily on her 3 archbishops of Canterbury, Parker, Edmund Grindal, and John Whitgift, to ensure conformity to church policies. This practice met with limited success, as Grindal, for instance, tended to side with the Puritans and was suspended from his duties during his term in office. The stronger efforts of Whitgift, who used a special court to punish Puritans and took active measures against the printers of the anti-episcopal anonymous, quote, Martin Marprelate, and the, quote, Martin Marprelate, end quote, tracts, 1588 to 1589, managed finally to alienate some dissenters from the church, led by a nonconformist minister named Robert Brown, who had established an independent congregation in Norwich. A number of Puritans separated from the Church of England and fled to the Netherlands to escape persecution. Some later traveled to America in hopes of a more reformed religious society. In general, however, most Puritans, who were by no means ideologically monolithic, tolerated the settlement and did their best to worship within its guidelines, possibly because they were not so fervent as to flirt with sedition. Despite regular agitation, the middle way religion established between 1559 and 1563 has withstood the test of time. Some minor revisions, this Reformed Church of England, only later to be known as Anglicanism, continues to be the national religion of England to the present day. Discussion question 4.2. Despite criticism from Puritans, many characteristics of the Elizabethan, the quote, Elizabethan settlement, end quote, continue to exist today. Why do you think the settlement was so successful in creating an enduring reformed religion? Mary of Scots and the Catholic menace. While Puritanism was a thorn in the side of Anglicanism and Elizabeth's authority to govern the church, the Catholic menace was their predator. Some Catholics of the Henrician stripe were sufficiently satisfied with the quote, middle way and quote, settlement to worship within the bounds set by the supreme governor. Others simply could not accept the new religion, a situation made worse by Pope Pius V's injunction in 1566 that true Catholics must not worship in Anglican churches. 2 years later, a series of Catholic problems was initiated by the arrival into England of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin by her Aunt Margaret. As a child queen, Mary had been sent to France while Scotland was ruled by regents. She returned in 1561, following the death of her husband, Francis II. By this time, Scotland was Presbyterian, which Mary, though a Catholic, tolerated with the help of her Protestant half-brother, the Earl of Moray, and a reform-minded council. Mary's second marriage to her cousin and fellow Catholic, Henry, Lord Darnley, in 1565 was despised by her Protestant subjects and quickly turned sour. Darnley demanded to reign equally with Mary, which would have made him heir to the throne upon her death, and accused her of having an affair with her secretary, David Riccio. After arranging the murder of Riccio, Darnley reconciled with the now pregnant Mary, and she gave birth to Prince James in 1566. The reconciliation did not last long. Within a year, Darnley was killed under suspicious circumstances, and rumors spread that the assassination had been arranged by Mary and her new lover, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. Fearing for his life, Bothwell ran away with and possibly kidnapped Mary, and the two were married. All this intrigue was too much for Mary's nobles, who promptly detained the queen, denounced her as an adulteress and murderer, and placed her in prison. In July, Mary was forced to abdicate her throne in favor of baby James, under the regency of Moray, and in 1568 she fled to England seeking Elizabeth's protection. The presence of the usurped Scottish queen on English soil presented problems. First, Mary had a legitimate claim as Elizabeth's heir, although the heirs of Henry VIII's sister Margaret were not mentioned in his last will and testament in favor of his sister Mary Tudor. The line stemming from Mary became tainted. Until her death in January 1568, the presumptive, though never acknowledged, heir to the throne had been Catherine Grey, Mary's granddaughter and Lady Jane's younger sister. Catherine left behind 2 sons, but her marriage to their father, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, had infuriated Elizabeth and could not at any rate be proven and had been annulled. With the line legally extinguished, Mary of Scots had the best, if still unacknowledged, claim as Elizabeth's heir. Elizabeth therefore found it necessary to give Mary lodgings in England as her, quote, guest, end quote. Although Mary was accorded the privileges that her rank and position demanded, she was nonetheless kept under close guard. The second complication was that Mary was Catholic. This meant that Elizabeth's death by natural or unnatural means could easily have led to the restoration of Catholicism. This concern became heightened when the plan of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk and head of England's wealthiest and most powerful Catholic family, to wed Mary was announced. Along with several other northern peers, Norfolk had come to believe that Cecil was the principal cause of England's problems, including its religious settlement. They also disapproved of the secular and reformist composition of the remainder of the council. When these concerns came to Elizabeth's attention, she supported Cecil and her council, forbade Norfolk's marriage to Mary, and demanded his presence at court for a stern rebuke. With Norfolk chastened, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland rose in rebellion and began marching south. The 4,500 or so rebels met approximately 19,000 troops loyal to the Queen, which caused the retreat and dispersal of the Earl's forces. Although Westmoreland escaped to the continent, Northumberland was captured by the Scots, handed over to the English, and promptly executed along with hundreds of rebels. While the Northern Rebellion was underway, the Pope attempted to lend his support for the uprising by issuing a papal bull excommunicating the, quote, pretended Queen of England, end quote, and releasing all subjects from her allegiance. One of the reasons given for issuing the bull was Elizabeth's choice to fill her council with, quote, obscure heretics, end quote, lending clear support for the goals of the northern earls. When the rebellion was suppressed, one of its supporters, Roberto Ridolfi, plotted to invade England with an army from the Netherlands and Spain, free Mary from her prison, ensure her marriage to Norfolk, and murder Elizabeth so that Mary could succeed and restore Catholicism. The plot ultimately failed because of the inability to foment sufficient support from English Catholics who were far less numerous than Norfolk and Ridolfi believed. When the entire conspiracy was discovered and reported to Cecil, Norfolk was arrested, convicted of high treason, and executed in 1572. Elizabeth resisted her advisor's recommendation that Mary be prosecuted for her part in the plot, but otherwise showed little tolerance for Catholics from the 1750s onward. In part, this was a reaction to an underground movement initiated by the arrival of Jesuits from England who could operate incognito and spread dissent without easy discovery. A series of parliamentary acts made it treason to call the Queen a heretic and illegal to say or attend Catholic Mass, convert to Catholicism, attempt to convert others, absent oneself from Church of England services, or harbor Catholic priest. These, quote, recussancy, end quote, acts prescribed penal measures ranging from crippling fines to imprisonment or even death. They also often resulted in the use of torture to extract confessions. This involved the body being broken on the rack, in which the prisoner was stretched on a wooden frame until his or her ligaments and muscles separated. The polar opposite of the rack was the, quote, scavenger's daughter, end quote, employed in the Tower of London. It was either a metal ring of about 2 feet in diameter or a metal A-frame into which the legs and body of a kneeling prisoner were savagely compressed. Where am I? Sometimes prisoners were placed into tight cages which were suspended from buildings where their bodies were preyed upon by birds and rats. It has been estimated that upwards of 200 people were executed in Elizabethan England because of their Catholicism. One particular famous example is that of Margaret Clitheroe. In 1586, after a decade of having run afoul of parliamentary legislation, leading to fines and imprisonment, Clitheroe was accused of harboring Catholic priests and enabling them to hold Mass. At trial, she refused to plead, probably to protect her 3 children and others from being subjected to torture and trial. Her refusal led to peine forte et dure, commonly known as, quote, pressing, end quote, which was the standard procedure when accused felons refused to plead at court. Normally, the accused was stripped of his or her clothes, save a cloth over the genitals, and laid out on the bare floor. Each limb was stretched taut with a rope, and the large stones or plates or iron were gradually placed on the prisoner's torso until he elected to plead or until he died. Clitheroe was pressed to death using this method, even though she was then pregnant with her 4th child. Clitheroe's martyrdom led to her canonization by the Catholic Church nearly 4 centuries later. A leading figure in the persecution of Catholics was Francis Walsingham, a committed Protestant and Elizabeth's principal secretary who managed through espionage and torture to uncover various Catholic plots. The most significant of these was the Babington plot of 1586. Walsingham had for some time read with Mary's knowledge all her incoming and outgoing correspondence. He entrapped Mary into believing that she could covertly send correspondence using encrypted letters smuggled by a brewer in beer kegs. Through this means, Anthony Babington wrote to Mary about a plot to kill Elizabeth, and Mary responded with encouragement and sanction. All the correspondence passed through Walsingham, who in fact had arranged the cipher code used to encrypt the letters. In July 1586, Walsingham was finally in possession of concrete evidence of Mary's complicity in a plan to assassinate Elizabeth that earlier plots had failed to provide. Mary's actions ran afoul of a, quote, bond of association, end quote, produced in 1584, which ordered the execution of any person who plotted against the Queen. The major obstacle to trying Mary under this device was Scotland's possible reaction to the execution of their king's mother, no matter how much she had disgraced herself. To allay these concerns, while the Babington plot was unfolding, Walsingham arranged the Treaty of Berwick with James VI, promising him an annual pension of £4,000, a substantial sum to a poor king, and without directly saying so, implying that James was heir to the English throne, provided that peaceful relations were maintained. With proof of Mary's guilt and the acquiescence of James VI, Walsingham and Cecil arranged a tribunal, during which Mary was found guilty and a warrant was prepared for her execution. Elizabeth signed the warrant, allegedly instructing that it not be put into action until she gave direct authorization. Notwithstanding, the Privy Council ordered that the sentence be carried out, and Mary was executed on February 8, 1587, with 2 strokes of the axe. Although Elizabeth was allegedly furious that her orders had been disobeyed, it is also possible that the whole affair was designed to give her plausible deniability as to her role in the regicide of her cousin and immediate heir. War with Spain. The final 2 decades of Elizabeth's reign witnessed a war with Spain, of which there were several causes. Since the 1560s, English ship captains had been distressing Spanish colonies in the New World. Sir John Hawkins undertook several slaving expeditions, collecting Africans from the west coast of Africa, transporting them across the Atlantic Ocean, and selling them to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and South America. All these activities challenged Spanish authority in the region, which saw all foreign trading in the Americas as illegal. In 1577, Sir Francis Drake began his famous 3-year circumnavigation of the earth, making his way around both America and in the process raiding numerous Spanish colonies and claiming ships' cargo and gold as his prize. Despite official Spanish complaints about Drake's piratical activities, Elizabeth had him knighted on the deck of his ship for his services to the nation. In addition, in 1585, the Earl of Leicester was sent to the Spanish Netherlands in command of several thousand men to aid in the struggle of the Protestant Dutch against their Catholic overlord, Philip II. When Spain responded by seizing English merchant ships in Spanish harbors, a state of war was unofficially declared that would continue until 1604. In the early stages of the war, Dawkins, Drake, and others became English, quote, privateers, end quote, operating with English royal letters of marque to distress the Spanish enemy in the Americas. The situation became far more serious after the execution of Mary of Scots, who for 2 decades had been the focal point of attempts to restore a Catholic monarch to the English throne. In retaliation, Philip II threatened to send an armada of ships to invade England, a plan that was initially thwarted when Drake, during the Cadiz expedition, managed to burn 37 Spanish ships and return to England with a booty exceeding £100,000. Drake's raid delayed the armada for about a year. In May 1588, 130 ships carried 26,000 men, 2/3 of them land soldiers, departing Lisbon under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who unfortunately lacked military command experience at land and on sea. The plan was for Medina Sidonia to join with an additional 30,000 troops under the command of the Duke of Parma in the Netherlands, land an army in England, and engage in a land battle. The armada sailed into the English Channel in July, its progress slowed by the presence of several troop-carrying merchant ships that had limited speed, which gave the English plenty of time to prepare its naval forces. After several brief engagements with the English, Medina Sidonia managed to bring the majority of his armada to Calais, where it was expected Parma's troops would be waiting. It turned out, however, that the army was days away. In the meantime, on July 28th, the English sent 8 fireships across the channel, which, assisted by the weather, forced the armada to raise anchor and make sail. Superior forces, better maneuverability, greater experience at sea battle, and weather all favored the English as they closed in for the Battle of Gravelines, Flanders, or Gravelines, Flanders, or Gravelines, Flanders. The Spanish ships were not well supported by cannon, and Medina Sidonia had expected to succeed with boarding parties rather than firepower. Instead, the English ships kept their distance and fired repeated damaging broadside volleys into the enemy's ships. Thousands of Spaniards died, several ships were lost, and many more severely damaged. All Medina Sidonia could do was limp back to Spain by sailing around Scotland and Ireland, a long and treacherous journey that saw the loss of dozens of ships. In the end, about 65 ships and 15,000 lives were lost, mostly from disease and starvation caused by the unexpectedly long trip home. In an age that viewed military victory as a sign of God's favor, the overwhelming English success at the Battle of Gravelines naturally provided a significant boost in the fight between Protestantism and Catholicism in England. Before news of the battle's success reached England, the Queen gave a speech to the assembled troops at Tilbury, Essex, that is considered to be her most famous oration. Arriving on a white horse, wearing a helmet and military breastplate, and carrying a sword and baton, Elizabeth supposedly said, quote, "Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects, and therefore I am come amongst you as you see in this time, not for my recreation or disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of battle to live or die amongst you all. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And take foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any other prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than my dishonor should grow by me, I myself will take up arms." End quote. Elizabeth. However accurate the reporting of Elizabeth's appearance and speech was, the arrival of the 55-year-old queen among a sea of soldiers preparing for battle surely had great impact on its audience. Although the defeat of the Armada was the most significant event of the Anglo-Spanish War, the conflict continued for another 15 years. An English Armada, roughly equal in size to the Spanish Armada, was sent to distress the King of Spain and his possessions in the Americas and the Azores. The Azores. I don't know how to say that. Azores. Under the command of Hawkins and Drake, but its successes were limited. Continued support of the Protestants in the Netherlands led to the conscription of nearly 100,000 young men. In 1596, the Earl of Essex and Sir Walter Raleigh brought an Anglo-Dutch fleet to Cadiz and sacked and burned the city, with devastating consequences for the Spanish, who burned their own naval fleet rather than let it fall into the hands of the enemy. By 1604, when peace was achieved in the Treaty of London, there was little doubt that England had been considerably more successful during the course of the war. But the terms of the treaty called for status quo ante bellum, the state that existed before the war, which meant that England's efforts during these conflicts were mostly an expensive diversion. England made no political or territorial gains in Europe and still struggled for legitimacy in the Americas. Elizabeth and her parliaments. As we have seen, meetings of Parliament were an occasional occurrence throughout the Tudor period, typically called when the monarch wanted support for contentious policies, such as the changes to religion, and when extraordinary income in the form of taxation, then known as subsidies, was necessary to supplement the royal treasury. Otherwise, the monarch's extensive prerogative powers, including the ability to issue proclamations, and the powers held by the Privy Council, were sufficient for the day-to-day administration of the realm. During the first quarter century of Elizabeth's reign, only 4 parliaments met for 7 sessions, averaging 1 session every 3.5 years. This contrasts sharply with the first 3 quarters of the century, when Parliament met, on average, every year and a half. This infrequency of Elizabeth's parliaments was the result of the fact that the Queen's treasury was kept reasonably full from the ordinary revenues of the crown. Despite some uprisings in the north and Ireland, England was not at war between 1559 and 1584, which meant that military expenses were kept to a minimum. Although Elizabeth maintained the grandeur of majesty at significant expense, she was, after all, a single woman. Unlike her father, she did not have to maintain households for other immediate members of the royal family, which also kept costs down. When funds were short, Elizabeth could still sell off some of the crown lands that remained from Henry's monastic dissolution, rely on some of the feudal dues resuscitated by her grandfather, and distribute various grants and commissions that provided her with additional income. These factors combined to limit the need for parliaments, a condition that was generally favorable to the populace, as meetings of Parliament almost always meant the approval of new taxes. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth had learned during her early parliaments that its members were not as submissive as she preferred. Although Parliament was primarily tasked with addressing the legislation put to it by the Queen and her Council, the House of Commons especially often took the opportunity to discuss issues that Elizabeth held to be personal in nature and part of her prerogative rights to determine. For example, Parliament frequently attempted to discuss the issues of religion, the Queen's marriage, and the succession of the crown, all of which Elizabeth generally held were outside of its jurisdiction. Such discussions sometimes led to the prorogation or dissolution of Parliament, which allowed Elizabeth to make speeches upbraiding its members for their obstinacy and temerity. Under these conditions, Elizabeth felt compelled to call Parliament only when it was needed. Elizabeth's views were somewhat at odds with contemporary writings about the role of the English Parliament. Sir Thomas Smith, Secretary of State from 1572 to 6, wrote in his De Republica Anglorum, written between 1562 and 1565, published in 1583, that, quote, "The most high and absolute power of the realm of England is in the Parliament. The Parliament abrogateth old laws, maketh new, established forms of religion, giveth forms of succession to the crown, defineth of doubtful rights, whereof is no law already made, appointeth subsidies and impositions, giveth most free pardons and absolutions. For every Englishman is intended to be there present, either in person or by procuration and attorneys, of what preeminence, state, dignity, or quality soever he be, from the prince, be he king or queen, to the lowest person of England, and the consent of the Parliament is taken to be every man's consent." Thomas Smith, De Republica, London, 1583, Book 2, Chapter 1. Smith's views were evidently not shared by a queen who, in 1563, wasted no time arresting and imprisoning several members of Parliament who colluded to discuss marriage and succession before the session began, even though the session was ultimately dominated by these issues. Even Parliament, however, recognized limitations on its independence, as evidenced by its detainment of fellow member Peter Wentworth in 1576 for arguing that members had absolute freedom of speech. In 1593, Wentworth was imprisoned for discussing the succession, never regaining his freedom before dying in the Tower in 1596. If it was possible, Elizabeth probably would have continued the infrequency of Parliament until the end of her reign. However, beginning in 1585, Elizabeth was forced to work more closely with Parliament because her ordinary income was no longer adequate to fund the needs of the nation. England was at war with Spain and in Ireland to be discussed, both of which to be discussed in parentheses, but both of which extended beyond Elizabeth's death. A series of agricultural crises in the 1590s caused impoverishment, unemployment, and inflation of food prices, a situation that was not helped by the severe plague outbreak of 1593. The result of these and other events was a financial shortfall exceeding £100,000 per year, which could only be met by parliamentary subsidy. Consequently, after 1584, Parliament met more often and for longer periods of time. The frequency of Parliament during these years brought about several discernible changes to its composition. Because of the rising population, the number of parliamentary seats under the Tudors had increased membership in the House of Commons from about 300 in Henry VIII's time to closer to 450 in Elizabeth's later parliaments. This made meetings of the Commons, which occurred after 1547 in the modest-sized St. Stephen's Chapel at Westminster Palace, extremely loud and crowded affairs. By contrast, the House of Lords had dwindled to about 75 owing to Elizabeth's frugality in creating peerages and the drop in the number of ecclesiastical members. With 6 times as many members in the Commons than in the Lords, the Commons began assuming greater authority with regard to law-making. In addition, a number of members returned over several sessions, which gave the Commons an institutional memory with regard to residual issues from previous sessions and the members' and Queen's general disposition about certain matters. Some members became, in essence, professional politicians and sometimes banded together in ways that had not been seen in the past. Many members of Parliament also increasingly came to be better educated, partly the result of humanism, with more than half the members in the later parliaments possessing university or law degrees. This gave them better knowledge of their historical rights and responsibilities in the mixed, quote, king in parliament, end quote, constitution described by Smith, which had developed since the start of Parliament in the late 13th century. Thus, for instance, the abuses of Parliament caused by the Privy Council forcing Reformation legislation through that body were becoming increasingly evident as Elizabeth's reign wore on. All of this is not to say that the relationship between Queen and Parliament was entirely antagonistic. But as the Commons did what it was asked in approving subsidies and legislation to deal with the problems of poverty, drought, and war, it was also becoming more self-aware and consequently more vocal and opinionated. Sometimes Elizabeth avoided confrontation by letting Parliament openly discuss issues and pass its bills, only to exercise her prerogative right of veto before they were enacted, which she did more than 60 times. At other times, she fiercely guarded her prerogative rights to determine certain issues by executive authority. The issue of monopolies served as the best example. To raise crown revenue outside of parliamentary subsidies and as a way to reward loyalty among her favorites, Elizabeth began in the 1580s to issue letters patent granting individuals the right to hold monopolies on certain products. Monopolists such as Walter Raleigh paid the crown for licenses and then collected a percentage of sales from their commodities, which forced merchants to pass the additional cost onto their customers. By 1601, there were literally hundreds of monopolies on salt, sugar, soap, silk, tobacco, beer, timber, wine, and almost anything else that was not considered among life's most basic necessities. Because these monopolies involved the regulation of trade, they were within the ambit of the royal prerogative, but Parliament viewed the additional cost to the consumer as a form of taxation. The issue of monopolies came up during several parliamentary sessions, and it became heightened in 1601 when the Commons attempted to make the practice illegal. Before they could do so, Elizabeth indicated her intention to speak with Parliament and gave her golden speech. Quote, golden speech being in capital letters, so I guess this is a remarkable speech in history. Quote, "We have heard your declaration and perceive your care for our estate. I do assure you there is no prince that loves his subjects better, or whose love can countervail our love. There is no jewel, be it of never so rich a price, which I set before this jewel. I mean your love. Of myself I must say this. I never was any greedy scraping grasper, nor yet a waster. Had I not received a knowledge from you about monopolies, that's in brackets. I guess I should say, had I not received a knowledge from you, bracket, about monopolies, end bracket, I might have fallen into the lapse of an error, only for lack of information. My grants should be grievous to my people, and depressions to be privileged under color of our patent. Our kingly dignity shall not suffer it. If my grants, bracket, have been, and end bracket, turned to the hurt of my people, contrary to my will and meaning, I hope God will not lay their culps, bracket, blame, end bracket, and offenses in my charge. I know the title of a king is a glorious title, but assure yourself that we also are to yield an account of our actions before the great judge. To be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that to see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it. And I pray that before these gentlemen go into their countries, you bring them all to kiss my hand." End quote. Queen Elizabeth. Coming from the mouth of a woman of nearly 70 years, who had been queen for more than 4 decades, this speech must have been a powerful one to listen to. That Elizabeth took this opportunity to dismiss her last parliament without giving it a chance for further discussion on monopolies, and gave only a vague indication that she would do anything about them, is a perfect reflection of how well Elizabeth had learned to manipulate her parliaments. Ultimately, monopolies and most of the parliament's perceived gains during Elizabeth's reign would return with a vengeance under the early Stuarts. Discussion question 4.3. Given the Tudors' tendency to use or abuse Parliament to support religious reform and the royal succession, why do you think the Queen was so resistant to allow Parliament to discuss these matters? Rebellion, coup, and death. Toward the end of her life, Elizabeth was forced to deal with one final rebellion. Overlordship over Ireland had been reasserted by Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell in the 1530s, leaving the island under the control of deputies with martial powers and well-staffed English military garrisons. In the early to mid-Elizabethan period, following a series of rebellions that were brutally suppressed by the English, large portions of Munster and southern Ireland had been granted to English Protestants in what has been referred to as the, quote, conquest of Ireland, end quote. These, quote, plantations, end quote, caused the displacement of many Gaelic Irish clans or septs. These regions operated under English law and religion, but were also forced to adapt to Ireland's customary Brehon law, or Brehon law, Brehon, and the fact that the majority of the Irish were still Catholic despite the adoption of supremacy and uniformity laws similar to England's. By the early 1590s, English authorities in Ireland attempted to extend their powers into the Ulster region of Northern Ireland, which was under the control of the wealthy and powerful Irish lord Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and also into the Pale, a region dominated by the Catholic, quote, Old English, end quote, who had settled during the Middle Ages and generally dissociated themselves from the Protestant newcomers in the south. A series of major skirmishes, coupled with the attempt of O'Neill to seek assistance from Spain, forced Elizabeth, whose resources had been stretched by the Anglo-Spanish conflict, into action in 1599. She sent a 17,000-strong army into Ireland under the command of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, Leicester's stepson, and a favorite at court since Leicester's death in 1588. The handsome young courtier turned out to be a poor general. Thousands of his troops died of typhus and dysentery while Essex blundered through southern Ireland, and his one major engagement, the Battle of Curlew Pass, was a disaster. Rather than engage the enemy as he was ordered to do, Essex in November 1599 agreed to a truce, the terms of which were heavily criticized by Elizabeth's new secretary, Robert Cecil. Elizabeth was angry at Essex's actions, and was even more so when the Earl unexpectedly returned to England to confront Cecil. Essex arrived at Nonsuch Place in Surrey and burst into the Queen's bedchamber while she was wearing night clothes and before her makeup had been applied, which constituted a major breach of royal protocol. Elizabeth charged Essex with abandoning his post and placed him under house arrest. A subsequent tribunal stripped Essex of most of his offices, and the Queen refused to renew his monopolies, leaving him heavily in debt. Disgraced and impoverished, Essex then attempted a peculiar coup d'etat. In February 1601, messengers were sent to Essex House to bring the Earl before the Star Chamber. Instead of complying, Essex took the Queen's messengers hostage, gathered 200 followers, and marched through London demanding the downfall of his enemy Cecil and an audience with the Queen. His actions were declared treasonous, most of his supporters abandoned him, and he returned briefly to Essex House before Crown forces besieged his home, forced his surrender. After a trial, Essex was convicted of treason and beheaded at the Tower. Meanwhile, Elizabeth sent Charles Blount, Baron Mountjoy, to Ireland to bring Tyrone and his followers to heel. By 1602, he had managed to complete his mandate, subduing Ulster, which enabled the formal plantation of Ulster by Scottish subjects beginning in 1609, repelling a Spanish invasion of Ireland and accepting Tyrone's surrender in April 1603. The surrender occurred about a month after Elizabeth's death on March 24th. The medical reasons for Elizabeth's death are unclear, but most speculate that it was caused by melancholy and depression. After the recent deaths of many of her friends. She never officially declared James as heir, but she knew this was the probable outcome, and in fact, Cecil had spent the previous 2 years preparing James for his accession. Question 4.4. How important were speeches such as the Tilbury speech and the Golden speech, and Elizabeth's choice to portray herself as the, quote, virgin queen, end quote, in her efforts to present herself as a good queen to her people? How does she use her gender to her advantage? Okay, that's the end of the chapter proper. Now we're on to Voices of the Past, which is the section at the end of each chapter about some execution or what have you, or thus far it's all about executions. Let's see what the last chapter says. Like, just out of curiosity, if there's one here. Oh. Come on. Yeah, I think they're all about death, which is fitting since the name of the book is Death and Disorder. Okay, Voices of the Past, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots had been involved in several plots against Elizabeth, although it was not until the Babington plot of 1586 that actual proof was discovered. Elizabeth was forced to sign her cousin's death warrant, but she ordered one of her secretaries of state, William Davison, not to carry out the warrant. The council defied her and ordered Mary to be beheaded in February 1587. The following extract records the events from Elizabeth's signing to the warrant until Mary's execution. There's and there's a picture here of the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. There's no, the person doing the executing is a man in black, but he doesn't have a hood on. So I don't think that's probably, I don't know, whenever I think of an execution, I think of someone wearing a hood over their face, but that's not the case here. Looks like she's blindfolded, maybe. Okay, so here we go, the actual text. Bracket, the Queen, end bracket, delivered a writing to Davison, signed with her own hand that a warrant under the Great Seal of England should be made for her execution, which should be in readiness if any danger should grow in that fearful time, and command him to acquaint no man therewith. But the next day her mind changed, and she commanded Davison that the warrant should not be drawn. Davison came presently to the Queen and told her that it was drawn and under seal already. She being somewhat moved, blamed him for such haste. He notwithstanding acquainted the council both with the warrant and the whole matter, and easily persuaded them that the Queen had commanded it should be executed. Presently, without all delay, was bracket order sent, end bracket, to see her executed according to the law. The fatal day now appearing, being the 8th of February, bracket Mary, end bracket, dressed herself gorgeously and curiously, as she was wont to do upon festival days, and calling her servants together, commanded her last will and testament to be read, prayed them to take their legacies in good part, then fixing her mind wholly upon God in her oratory, with signs, groans, and prayers, she craved his divine favor, till Thomas Andrews, sheriff of the county, signified unto her that she must now come forth. And forth she came with stature, countenance, and presence composed unto majesty, a cheerful look, matron-like, and very modest habit. Her head covered with a linen veil, and that hanging down, her prayer beads hanging at her girdle, and carrying a crucifix of ivory in her hands. In the gallery she was received by one of her servants, pouring forth tears, bewailing his hap, bracket, situation, end bracket, that he was to carry into Scotland the woeful news of the unhappy fate of his lady and mistress. She comforted him, saying, quote, lament not, but rather rejoice. Thou shalt by and by see Mary Stuart freed from all cares. Tell them that I die constant in my religion and firm in my fidelity towards Scotland and France. God forgive them which have thirsted for my blood as harts, bracket, male deer, end bracket, do after the fountain. Thou God, which art truth itself, and thoroughly and truly understandest the inward thoughts of my heart, knowest how greatly I have desired that the kingdoms of England and Scotland might be united in one. Commend me to my son, and certify him that I have done nothing which may prejudice the kingdom of Scotland. Warn him to hold amity with the Queen of England, and see thou do him faithful service. End quote. Which when she had said, and turned herself away, it was merited that her servants whom she would name should be present. So the gentlewoman, 2 earls and the sheriff of the shire going before her, she came to the scaffold which was erected at the supper end of the hall, on which was set a chair, a cushion, a block, all covered with black cloth. As soon as she was set, in silence proclaimed. Beale, clerk of the council, read the warrant. She heard it attentively. Then, the Dean of Peterborough, began a long speech unto her touching the conditions of her life past, present, and to come. She interrupted him once or twice as he was speaking, praying him, quote, not to trouble her, protesting that she was firm and resolute in the Catholic Roman religion, and for that was ready to shed her blood, end quote. Then, she falling down upon her knees and holding the crucifix before her in her hands, prayed in Latin with her servants. After the dean had made an end of prayer, she in English commended the church, her son, and Queen Elizabeth to God, beseeching him to turn away his wrath from this island, and professing that she reposed her hope of salvation in the blood of Christ, lifting up the cross. She called upon the celestial choir of saints to make intercession for her. She forgave all her enemies, and kissing the crucifix and signing herself with the cross, she said, quote, as thy arms, O Christ, were spread upon the cross, so receive me with the stretched out arms of thy mercy, and remit my sins, end quote. Then the executioners asked her forgiveness, which she granted them. And when the women servants had taken off her outer garments, wailing and lamenting her case, she kissed them and signed them with the cross. With a cheerful countenance bade them forbear their womanish lamentations, for now she should rest from her sorrows. In like manner, turning to her men servants who wept with her, and now having covered her face with a linen handkerchief, and lying down at the block, she recited the psalm, quote, in thee, O Lord, do I trust. Let me never be confounded, end quote. Then stretching forth her body and repeating many times, quote, into thy hands, Lord, I commend my spirit, end quote. Her head was stricken off at 2 blows, the dean crying out, so let Queen Elizabeth's enemies perish, and the Earl of Kent answering, quote, Amen, end quote. As soon as a rumor was brought to Queen Elizabeth's ears, who little thought it, that the Queen of Scots was put to death, she heard it with great indignation. Her countenance and her words failed her, and with excessive sorrow she was in a manner astonished, inasmuch as she gave herself over to grief, putting herself into mourning weeds, garments, and shedding abundance of tears. Her council she sharply rebuked and commanded them out of her sight, subjecting them to examination. The source of that passage was William Camden Annals, or the history of the most renowned and victorious Princess Elizabeth, late Queen of England, London, 1635. Discussion question 4.5. If Mary, Queen of Scots, was guilty of treason and showed so many outward signs of her Catholicism on the day of her death, why do you think Camden's description of her death is so sympathetic?